Good afternoon, everybody, and a warm welcome back. In business, we like to say, what gets measured gets done. And this session is all about the latest developments in corporate accountability systems, specifically how they relate to reporting on nature. So I hope that you'll find this a very valuable and insightful session on what's happening in the world of metrics. Our goal is to provide you with tangible solutions that will link accountability and performance measurement so that you can use this to reduce pressure on key drivers that are affecting nature. I'm Jeff Turner. I'm a senior advisor at World Business Council for Sustainable Development. In a former life, I was the head of sustainability for DSM, a Dutch multinational in nutrition and health. And in that time, we took a leadership role on climate and on ESG reporting. So I've been around the topic for a while, and I'm pleased to say that in that period, I was actually involved in the setup of WBCSD's work on metrics. WBCSD brings together around 200 global corporations. It's member-centric, and it's led by the CEOs of those companies. And so bringing together that kind of a stakeholder group to develop metrics means that you have business solutions developed by business. In addition to those 200 corporate members, we have business associations in about a dozen countries, which adds to that network SMEs and national champions. So this is not purely the view of global corporations. It does extend into the SME sector. Now, we know that about 90% of nature loss is due to the extraction and processing of raw materials. And research by Citra, and Tim will be joining us on stage shortly, has shown that circular levers actually can substantially reverse and halt nature loss. And we'll dig into that a little bit. I'll introduce the panel shortly, but first I'd like to talk a little bit about the circular transition indicators, which actually today we're announcing version 4. The circular transition indicators were first launched, well, the work was done in 2019, and they were launched in 2000. We're now already in the 4th iteration, and this iteration actually introduces for the first time a nature metric, land use in particular. There's about 2,000 corporate users of this metric system, and it was purposefully developed with a cross-section of businesses and industries to be a standardized approach that would apply in virtually every sector. So there is now guidance being developed to implement these metrics in different sectors, but keeping to the standardized approach. The reason for that, of course, is that as you go back through the value chains, you get convergence, and a lot of upstream companies are involved in a lot of downstream industries. So we really wanted to avoid having a plethora of metrics for different industries, and that I think we've done. The existing CTI system already addresses greenhouse gas emissions and water circularity, and now we'll be able to add to it nature. I'm pleased to say that in the future, the next iteration is already under development, and that will introduce for the first time considerations of equity impact of circularity. The new report will be available. Actually, as we go through the slides, you'll see a QR code come up from time to time. So if you want to scan the QR code, you'll be able to download a copy of the report straight away. At this point, if I could ask the panelists to come up and join me, please, so that we can discuss developments in nature and circularity. Joining me here are Helen Temple from the Biodiversity Consultancy, Tim Forsland from Citra, Jennifer Black from the World Benchmarking Alliance, and Christian Borgen from Bayer Crop Science. Please, thank you. Thanks for joining me on stage. And Helen, if I could turn to you first. if that's okay, since you're sat next to me, it seems to make sense. As we know, you're one of the founding members of the Biodiversity Consultancy, and you've been involved in the field, can I say how long, or would you rather I didn't?
You're welcome to say.
Okay, so 20 years, I think. So you've a lot of experience in advising businesses of all sizes and different sectors on their nature performance. How has the narrative on nature action changed over that time, would you say? And are there any particular developments that we should be aware on? How will those affect businesses going forward? Perhaps you could comment on that.
So yeah, as you said in your introduction, I've been working with large companies and financial institutions on their approaches to nature and to biodiversity, probably for rather longer than I want to think about at the moment. But it's really fair to say that over the last couple of years, there's been a sort of a real step change in the level of interest and in the kind of the scale of action and ambition that companies are taking across kind of real wide range of different companies, a huge variety of different sectors. And I think if we look at what's sort of driving this and what's sort of driving the business case, those are three main areas that I wanted to highlight. And first up, and I think foremost in everyone's minds at the moment, is the really tight connection between the nature crisis and the climate crisis. So it's widely accepted by business now that climate change is a material risk. And it's completely mainstream now to companies to be setting emissions targets in line with global goals for climate. But what we've really increasingly come to see over recent years, and what the science is showing very clearly, is how nature and climate are inextricably linked. They're really flip sides of the same coin. We can't solve for one without solving for the other. I think a second and a sort of related point is that there's really an increased understanding of not only the sort of the impact that business is having on nature, but the dependency that so many different kinds of companies have on the goods and services that come from nature. I mean, it's a well-known figure. It gets trotted out a lot of these kind of meetings that the World Economic Forum's estimate that 44 trillion of global GDP, so that's more than half of global GDP, is moderately or highly dependent on nature. You hear that figure a lot. It's also completely untrue. I mean, 100% of our economy is dependent in one way or the other on what comes from the natural world, but it's fair to say that there are some particular sectors, food and ag, forestry, textiles and fashion, construction and building that are really tightly linked, have a really clear dependency in terms of their business models. And then the sort of the third real thing driving the changed business case is rapidly evolving consumer and stakeholder expectations, and that's happening at the same time in which there's a kind of an explosion in transparency, in the availability of data, and just how interconnected the world is. Companies are going to be held accountable for negative impacts in their operations, in their supply chains that were simply just invisible before. And if we look at how that's sort of is changing the regulatory and policy landscape for nature, again, that's a sort of a very fast-moving space at the moment. There's a lot happening, but there's a couple of recent developments that I wanted to highlight. The first one being at the EU scale, the new Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive that many of you will be familiar with. So that came into force back in January of this year, and basically requires all large companies and all listed SMEs to publicly disclose information on their ESG impacts, and that's explicitly including biodiversity and ecosystems as part of that. So that's just sort of one example of sort of part of the global drive that we're seeing with things like the Task Force for Nature-related Financial Disclosures and other things, to greater transparency, disclosure, standardization of information on nature impacts. Then there's the Global Biodiversity Framework that was signed up to by almost all nation states in Montreal just before Christmas. basically what that does is it sets the apex goals for nature in the same way that Paris Agreement sets the apex goals for climate. And what that does that's really interesting for companies is it opens the door to setting science-based targets for nature in the same way that companies are currently able to do for climate. And sort of notably on that front, the new methods for setting science-based targets for fresh water and for land were launched just Wednesday of last week. So well worth looking up. And then I think, as you were asking about, sort of what's changed, what's shifted over the time that I've been working in this space. And the one last thing that I wanted to talk about that's kind of particularly relevant to the topic we're here to talk about today is just the incredible acceleration that there's been in the sort of the data and metrics and tools that are now available to support companies who want to measure their impacts and start taking action. So if you look just a few years back, it simply wasn't possible for a company to measure its biodiversity footprint across a complex supply chain where you have incomplete sourcing data or across a kind of complex financial portfolio. And I'd often hear a few years back, we just don't have the data as an excuse or as a reason given for not taking action. And that's one of the reasons why I'm really excited that we've had the opportunity to work recently with WBCSD to integrate nature and biodiversity into the sort of the new version of the circularity transition indicators, because it's a fantastic tool for helping companies to get that more holistic picture and to be able to make informed decisions in this sort of complex world.
Good, yeah. No, thank you. And I think you're right. I mean, the time for excuses on the basis that the information isn't available is behind us now. And as you quite rightly said, I mean, the links between nature and climate and equality are increasingly evident. So, what trade-offs would you say that companies should be aware of when looking at their circularity strategies, and how can the indicators perhaps help them address that, would you say?
So I'd like to, I'll answer that one by giving an example from some work that we did recently with a big global beauty and personal care company.
Okay.
And we were working with them on their 10-year corporate sustainability targets. And as part of that, one of the things that they were looking at doing was making a target around how to reduce their use of petrochemicals.
Yeah.
And they were considering making a commitment that basically would completely, for their packaging, phase out use of petrochemical plastics and change 100% of packaging across all of their product lines to be based on bioplastics. So on the face of it, sounds like a positive change. It's good. But we were not quite so sure that that would be a positive change from a nature perspective. So what we did was we got the data, we ran a set of different scenarios and analyses, and basically what it wound up showing was that just making that sort of simple switch wholesale to bioplastics, it would massively increase their supply chain land occupancy footprint, it would increase their biodiversity footprint, and actually, unexpectedly, it wasn't great for their greenhouse gas footprint either, because of the emissions associated with land conversion, land occupancy, land degradation from that bigger land footprint. So in the end, the company decided to go with a different approach, one with a sort of a much stronger emphasis on increasing recycled content, decreasing packaging volume, all of those sort of classic circularity measures. So I think the key message here is, there's not always trade-offs. There's a huge amount of scope in climate, in nature, in livelihoods and social well-being for win-win-wins. But sometimes there are going to be trade-offs. But the key thing that you need to do is make sure you're making these complex decisions in an evidence-based way, and without any blind spots. Yeah.
No, I'm sure that resonates with a lot of people. We can oversimplify and assume that some of the alternative solutions out there don't have a negative consequence of their own. So, as you said, getting the full data together and being able to look at it in the whole I think is critical. And I'm sure, Tim, that resonates with you because you've recently published a landmark report as Citra, where for the first time you've been quantifying the impact of circular strategies on nature. And I understand there were some fairly striking results that led you to some interesting roadmap conclusions for some sectors. You know, as a specialist in the field, could you tell us a little bit about what you've discovered and perhaps some of the examples that you've unearthed?
Certainly, and I think you have already set the scene very nicely by highlighting that 90% of biodiversity loss is due to the extraction and processing of natural resources, according to the UN International Resource Panel and their Global Resources Outlook. And what you see in there, as well as Helen highlighted the importance of biomass, that 80% of this biodiversity loss is due to biomass extraction and processing in particular. So this is really, really central. And in our study tackling root causes, we see this as well. And what we try to do is in a way to avoid these quick fixes, to look at substitution, for instance, as a panacea, and to try to take a more fully circular approach to the bioeconomy. And what we saw is that if we look at products and material and we try to make things that last longer, are used with higher use rates, so more times, and if they're circulated more, we can reduce our resource use by, well, significantly, and also our land use, because that's really important, since the single largest driver of biodiversity loss is land use change. So that is really, really important. And in the study, we saw that if we apply a circular economy thinking to the four sectors that drive the most biodiversity loss, we can halt biodiversity loss already in the next decade by 2035 and enable a recovery back to the same levels of biodiversity as we had in the year 2000.
Well, that's a pretty significant and quite reassuring perspective. Of course, you know, we have to make it happen. And as you said, where the extractive industries are inevitable, the key is keeping the products in circulation for longer and focusing on repair actions. I'm very aware that there's probably people in the audience who are dying to scream, it's not all about land use. And I'm sure they'll also realize that it was a conscious choice for the people working on the circularity transition indicators to start with land use, because it is the biggest category and driver of nature loss. So Tim, you know, what would you say would be the next most logical category of impact on nature, and perhaps what perspectives you would have on what should happen next?
Sure, I think there's, land use change is 1 out of 5 drivers of biodiversity loss, and we try and tackle all 5 of those. But as it stands, about 80 to 90% of biodiversity loss is still tied to land use change. So we need to really think about the role that biomass has and apply circular economy thinking to these sectors. So we looked at, well, food and agriculture, fibers and textiles, and buildings and construction, and the forest sector as well. So we see that land use is the single largest driver, because these sectors just take up a lot of our land.
Right.
But of course, I'm intrigued also by the work that we have, for instance, in Finland. We have worked with the, Helen mentioned the science-based targets for nature that was published last week. So we have worked with FIBS, which is the largest corporate responsibility network in the Nordics, to pilot the science-based targets for nature with 10 large companies in Finland. And as the methodology has developed, we see that pollution, for instance, is one of the first elements that were put out there, where there's companies already have some data. So I think that is also really significant. Or for some of the companies that participated in the pilot, that was actually their biggest impact on nature. So there's no one-size-fits-all approach to say that it's always about land use, because it's not.
That's a great example, and it's, I think, also reassuring for all of us to hear you reconfirm that not only have the science-based targets for nature now been published, but also that some companies have already started to pilot how to implement them, and in fact are developing those kind of insights. It's not simple, but at least we have systems that we can now use to develop insights and measure. Thanks, Tim. Moving on to Jenny from the World Benchmarking Alliance. You've been doing some really great work on linking corporate sustainability, circularity, and nature action. We heard from Helen the very strong case for business action on nature, and indeed went as far as making a strong case for why businesses should become nature positive. How can we measure progress towards becoming nature positive? Is there a way to measure that?
Yeah, that's a question that's incredibly close to my heart and close to the World Benchmarking Alliance, because fundamentally what we're about and our purpose is basically embedding corporate accountability by measuring and by tracking corporate progress on the Sustainable Development Goals. So what we've done is we've essentially translated the SDGs into 7 different transformations that we see needing to happen in order for us to achieve them. One of those transformations focuses on nature, and that's the transformation that I lead. And so within the nature transformation, we have developed a methodology that is really the culmination of many different stakeholder expectations on companies. So it's a multi-stakeholder methodology that builds on TNFD, SBTN, GRI, WBCSD, WWF. I could keep going on. We had more than 100 organizations actually fed into the methodology development because it was important for us that really we're measuring companies on things that are important to stakeholders and that stakeholders have really clear expectations of companies to deliver on. So we developed this methodology that essentially breaks down nature into 3 measurement areas. One is on governance and strategy, the second is on ecosystems and biodiversity, and the third is social inclusion and community impact. And I think we've heard from a few different speakers in the plenary and also here of just how important it is to not decouple nature from people. So that was really kind of crucial to us. And what we do is we have 1,000 companies in the nature benchmark. It's a big one. They're global companies with global value chains and a global footprint. And we assess them every 2 years against this methodology of 25 indicators. And within each indicator, they get scored on individual elements that range from kind of a basic ask all the way through to really quite sophisticated kind of stretch ask. And by repeating this process every 2 years up to 2030 and beyond, which we know is the key year for the Global Biodiversity Framework, we really want to hold companies accountable and for stakeholders to have that kind of understandable, comparable data that enables them to make it consequential for business. You know, it's one thing to measure it, but what happens next? What do the investors do with that information? What do policymakers do? What do NGOs do? Mm-hmm. So we absolutely think that it is possible to measure it. Of course, there are always some trade-offs with what you include in a methodology or don't include, but it's absolutely possible to measure progress. I think we released the first iteration of sort of 400 or so companies at COP15, and certainly sort of my key takeaway from that is in order to measure progress, you have to understand what your baseline is. And unfortunately, at the moment, only 5% of the companies that we've assessed actually know their impacts on nature right now. And that is just, I don't know, my jaw dropped when I actually saw that from the research team, and I was quite alarmed because essentially that means that it's going to be very difficult to track progress. It's going to be very difficult to understand if the actions that you're taking are on the right issues in the right areas without that initial assessment. So I think that really my kind of key message here is it's absolutely possible, and we need to start now in order to have the time to scale up and achieve the goals of the GBF by 2030.
Very cool. And I mean, as you said, you know, there's 1,000 companies in the nature bank. That's very significant. So you've got a good pool of data there. How do you see then companies are actually addressing circularity strategies in their overall corporate strategy? Because you were very clear that it's not only about measuring action in the value chains, but also looking at their governance and strategy setup. So I presume you have some insights into how companies are integrating circularity into their governance and strategy structures.
Yeah, so the good news is that I think circularity is certainly being accepted as a key enabler to achieving other goals on climate or biodiversity and other kind of sustainability issues. How it's being taken up is still quite patchy. So there's quite a lot of regional disparity, but also sectoral disparity. I think around 77% of the companies that we looked at that were headquartered in the EU mention circular economy in some way in their sustainability reporting. That sounds really good. But then once you start to drill down into what does that really mean, what are they doing, which is really the corporate accountability piece, you see that actually only 22% are currently reporting on one or more of the quantitative indicators in the CSRD legislation that's coming up. So that's 55% of those European headquartered companies mentioning circular economy, but not yet sort of translating that into action that they're measuring and reporting against. Right. And just for some kind of context, it's about 49% in North America mention it in some way, 40% in Asia, big sectoral differences. We see construction materials and packaging as really sort of being ahead of the curve on this. So there's a lot of patchy uptake, and I think that this is where the work of WBCSD and others is so important, because not just on circular economy, but on a whole range of the issues that we look at within the nature methodology, you need this to be driven by the C-suite and by the board and to be coming from the top, because no sustainability issue can really be solved just by the sustainability department, but I think more so than many others, circular solutions have to come from across the business.
I agree, absolutely. Well, I mean, that's sort of good news and bad news, right? I mean, good news is 77% mention circularity. Bad news is they got no idea how to measure it, so they actually don't have a metric on it. So only 22% do that. So hopefully the work on metrics will help to plug that gap. There's no question that circularity is critical in its own right, and also as a driver of climate. And if I can just make a comment on that, from my experience in corporate life, setting a science-based target and a roadmap for delivering on net zero, very quickly learned that about 10 years from now, you will need to redesign your products and processes to be circular in order to continue to deliver on net zero. And it takes about roughly 7 to 10 years for major product and process innovation. So the key message is start now, start having those conversations with technology leaders, with innovation leaders, because 10 years from now you'll run out of the easy things to do, of electrifying everything and switching to renewable electricity. You will need circularity to deliver even on your climate goals, and of course your nature goals are integrated with that. Christian, I'm going to turn to you now. At the end of the line, we've heard all of this great work around measuring and engaging with companies, but you're where the rubber hits the road at Bayer Crop Science. You're one of those companies that actually has the challenges of transforming itself, in this case, in the agricultural industry. And as we heard, there's a big shifts towards circularity in the food and ag sector, and these have a very big potential in actually reversing nature loss. Up to 73% of the opportunity comes from food and ag transformation. And we heard about the actions that business can take to improve their performance in that area. So my question very simply is, okay, that's the size of the opportunity. We hear about examples. So perhaps you could share a little bit of what's going on at Bayer Crop Science, please.
Sure, happy to do, and also happy to be here. So within Bayer, we work on principles of circular economy. So it's really focusing on reducing waste, pollution, reduction of greenhouse gas emissions. And when it comes to agriculture, it's really providing farmers with the tools, with the methods they need for different kind of agriculture, which is regenerative, like regen ag. And here the real focus is that it's outcome-based. For us as industry, it's very important that it's combined also with a good economic performance. So a good example where we combine both the environmental and the economic perspective with concrete metrics are the Pro Carbono field trials in LATAM, where we actually measure, like for the farmers, the increase in profitability. We look at the increases in the yields in the field, but at the same time, we also look at environmental metrics. So it's about carbon sequestration in the fields. We measure the greenhouse gas balance, and we also have a look on the soil evolution. So it's about the soil properties. So it's actually about avoiding soil degradation and even moving it towards better state. So, but this is indeed a very large collaborative approach, and I think this is also an important aspect of circular economy, that you work with different partners. So this is basically also driven by universities, by academia. It's also driven by farmer associations, which is quite important, and also by actually authorities as well, and also other industry partners. So very large collaboration. Then it then comes to the reporting, and we already heard it with the science-based targets, and then doing the proper reporting on this. So Bayer has now joined the TNFD, so the Task Force for Nature-Related Financial Disclosures. And compared to the climate space, it's a bit different here, because for climate we talk about the scopes, while for the TNFD we rather talk about whether it's about our own operations, so what we have directly in our hands, where we have data ownership, which is also quite important. Then it's about the upstream, so it's our supply chain, where we are interacting with our suppliers. And then it's also about the downstream. Then it's about the products or the solutions that are sold to the customers. So we really need to distinguish own operations, the upstream, and also the downstream. And here it's really about the metrics that become decisive. And what we need to do here is really to focus on metrics that deliver on the outcomes. I think a very good example is the greenhouse gas emissions metric, the carbon dioxide equivalent, because it captures a full range of different greenhouse gas emitters, sources. So this is a very good one, and it really steers decision-making also within our company. So when it comes to our supply chain, it's the decision towards the lower greenhouse gas emitting resource. So for this space, it works quite well. When we then look for agriculture, it gets much more complicated, more diverse. And what we did there for the agriculture sphere was to have a look on the Sustainable Development Goals, similar to what you're doing. And we had there a special look on the SDG 241, which is about sustainable and productive agriculture. And we think this is quite an interesting metric, because it covers all three dimensions of sustainability. So it looks at the environmental side, but also at the social and the economic one. So it's all combined. When we then look for the overlap to regen ag, there is quite a big one when it comes to soil health. For the SDG 241, it's really about avoiding soil degradation, while for regen ag, it's more about the nature positive outcomes. For example, when you then start sequestering carbon in the soils. So this was basically what we then used as inspiration. I also had my own field trials on sustainability in the field, and also had made my own experience about whether some metrics are rather useful to measure or not.
Well, it's great to have the hands-on experience. And a couple of times there, Christian, you stressed outcome-based metrics. So what I take from that is two things. One is it's not just measuring things for the sake of measuring, but you actually want to turn that into decisions that will improve things. And the other thing that I would take from that is that while we need to keep an eye on the entirety of circularity in terms of how closed loop the inputs are as well as the outputs, we do need to make sure that they're linked to outcomes for society and outcomes for business. So great insights, also great to hear you conducting your own trials. There's a question from the audience which I'm going to put to you and maybe to others as well. To what extent does transparency and the use of technologies such as blockchain and other ways to share data through the value chain, to what extent has that been a lever for you at Bayer?
So what we're currently doing in terms of transparency is a rather large initiative, which is about how we're doing things, how we steer our decision making, but also how we basically ensure the safety of our products. So what we put actually on our website are the safety-related product studies.
Right.
So this is a very large initiative, so everyone can have a look inside the data, how the products have been tested. Of course, it has a lot also to do with data ownership, so we can't do it for substances that we don't own. Mm-hmm. But I think this also it contributes there quite a lot. And when it comes to the downstream, like for the environmental implications of the use of certain products, what we actually have here, we linked it to our sustainability commitments. So we have the EIR, which is about the environmental impact reduction. So we're using like externally validated models. So UseTalks PEST LCI has been actually developed by academia, and we're using those models actually to improve the sustainability profile of our products in the field. And this is then actually followed then by our sustainability reporting.
That's also helpful, and I'm pleased that you stress the fact that where you can, you're being very transparent with the information that's yours, and hopefully, as we become more comfortable in sharing pre-competitive information, then you'll be able to share the information that others hold as well that's relevant to your products. Are there any other sort of examples beyond Bayer that you've come across of outcome-based metrics that you think would be relevant to talk about here?
So when it comes to metrics, I think what's quite helpful, I think it's also across the industry, what is actually reported on in the sustainability reporting.
Right.
Because there you also have the corresponding mechanisms of verification, of auditing, external auditing in the background. Mm-hmm. And here we're really focusing on the downstream aspect. So when it comes to climate commitments, we're focusing really here on the downstream because we think here we can achieve most. Example is also when it comes to water use efficiency. Here it's providing farmers with solutions that can actually contribute to achieving this kind of goal. For example, dry-seeded rice. And by the way, it also contributes quite a lot to achieving greenhouse gas commitments. So it's actually combining those aspects.
Good, thanks for that. On the question of the use of technology, I'll open it to the other panelists, and perhaps you, Helen, from the work that you've been doing. Have you observed any recent changes in the extent to which companies are relying on digitalization and on transparency reporting to enable their actions within the value chain?
So yeah, I don't have so much of a specific comment on blockchain, which the original question was about, but in terms of looking at how new technology and data and the possibility of rapidly sharing that data has changed things. Yeah, it's remarkable, what we have now freely available with things like sort of Google Earth, with like real-time, very high resolution satellite imagery. In the past, if, say, a palm oil company cleared an area of forest in Indonesia with orangutans that they weren't supposed to touch, nobody would have known about it. Yeah. Now we know about it immediately. It's visible to the whole world. Your actions are visible in the way that they just didn't used to be. And that sort of thing combined with some of the developments that we now have in sort of some of the citizen science and just simple mobile phone-based technologies that allow, say, smallholder farmers to easily record and share data and information about their management practices or things they're observing on their farm and share that information in a standardized and freely available format. There's some really interesting innovation that's been done using novel techniques like eDNA and things like passive acoustic monitoring. That, because one of the real challenges with biodiversity and with the sort of the monitoring and disclosure piece is how do we really verify what's going on and how do we verify what's happening on the ground in a scalable and cost-effective way.
Right.
And what's possible now compared to 5-10 years ago, it's a huge shift, and I think we're just on the beginning of a kind of inflection point of what's possible there.
And I certainly recognise everything you said. I think the point is, from the point of view of a set of metrics which drive disclosure, which allow business and financial decisions to be made, there needs to be transparency and an exchange of information that builds trust in the metrics themselves and the people that are disclosing them and the people that are evaluating them. So I think that's probably the key message around the transparency of the information. Yeah, thanks. We're doing very well on time, so we got plenty of time for further remarks and summaries. If I could pass to you, Tim, for your thoughts, having heard the reflections of the panelists around the topic. Any further thoughts that you would care to share?
Sure, you mentioned trust, and I think that is a superpower in the circular economy. And one of the main architects of the circular economy, Ken Webster, has framed the circular economy as being about 3 kinds of flow. So materials, energy, and information. And this often gets overlooked, but without information flows that work, we can't have a circular economy. Often, I think some of the best circular economy solutions out there are the ones that make use of readily available materials that are maybe just idling, that you can just enable access to these resources. So I think that is really critical in the circular economy transition, and especially when you try and look at nature as well. And here I think this interface with nature becomes so clear. So for instance, I think Christian mentioned with SBTN, so the science-based targets for nature, so that you have to look upstream at your own operations and also downstream. So I think there's quite good guidance both for SBTN and TNFD for what kind of data you actually need. So in some cases, you can rely more on, estimates and national averages, but whereas with certain types of information from your own operations, it's necessary to have not just secondary data. You need your own primary data, and for some of your suppliers, that's absolutely data sharing in that kind of context is, of course, absolutely essential to even set science-based targets for nature in the first place.
And you're absolutely right to remind us, if we needed reminding, that circularity is not only about the material world, it's about the information flows that underpin that as well. Thanks, Tim. Jenny, if I may pass to you, any thoughts and insights from the conversation?
Yeah, I mean, Tim just mentioned the guidance coming from TNFD and SBTN, and certainly one thing that we hear often from companies when we're benchmarking them is that nature is a bit of an alphabet soup. It's a very crowded space with lots of different actors all trying to pressure them to focus on different things. And I think my message there is kind of twofold. The first being that there is a phenomenal amount of coordination work going on behind the scenes. I think nobody working in this space wants to really be competing with others working in this space. We want to actually be achieving impact. And TNFD, SBTN, the World Benchmarking Alliance and others, there's really a phenomenal amount of coordination going on. And I think that the message is clear that stakeholder expectations and that clarity of what is good enough, I think, is really starting to come out now. And I think, for instance, we measure companies on a few indicators on water withdrawal and water pollution and things like this. And we saw that quite a few companies had some form of target on water, but very few of them scored for it because it was lacking a baseline year or a target year or reporting progress. And you can really see that now there's a much clearer understanding among the business community, but also among investors and NGOs and policymakers in terms of if you're taking action on water, it needs to be fulfilling these sort of 3 checkboxes in order for it to be meaningful and contributing to the goals that we all have, these kind of shared goals. And I think the second takeaway is also, like, you're not alone in your journey. And I think that Christian was really talking a lot about the work that Bayer has been doing. And there's a lot of tools, like the new CTI indicators that you've just launched. There's a whole host of guidance and tools and advice that is available to businesses who want to sort of take action on this. And actually some of the business platforms and industry associations are also doing really fabulous work in bringing together their members to discuss these kind of shared challenges, because not every business needs to kind of be reinventing the wheel and going through the same process. And actually it's important that we learn from each other in order to then scale up and achieve the change that we need by 2030.
Good. Thank you, Jenny. Well, I mean, in your remarks, you made reference to the great work that Bayer's doing and the fact that there are now tools to support that. So, Christian, perhaps you have any final thoughts before we move to questions. I should say that the reason I keep looking at my phone is because I'm being fed with online questions, but I'm giving you fair warning now. I will be turning to the audience for questions in a moment or two. Christian.
Yeah, so maybe a final thought. When it comes to the metrics, it's really about the effectiveness and also the robustness. Besides, how expensive is it really to measure? It's also a question of data ownership. So is it data that is owned by a company, or is it maybe data that is owned by customers, like by farmers in the field? And when it comes to circular solutions, I think it's also quite important that they are actually able to shift the sustainability of the business. For example, when we look at SDG 241 on sustainable agriculture, so basically if you plug in a circular solution within this farm management, that it actually boosts the performance towards the better in terms of sustainability performance. And it's also about focusing on the challenges the farmers have in the field, like providing different options, like for managing their challenges. Example is when you see that there's soil erosion going on in the land, then really offer the tools that are provided for actually soil conservation. And I think when we look at regenerative agriculture, it encompasses many of those already.
Right. Yeah, I mean, I think that's also important, is we need to look at the big picture. And, you know, while, of course, soil quality is not directly part of your areas of responsibility, you recognize the impact that can have on the overall sector and on the value chain. So it's getting that holistic view. Thanks, Christian. As I said, there are a couple of questions coming in, and perhaps we'll turn to those before we open up to the audience here. Incentivizing companies not only to measure their impact, but also on nature in particular, but also to act on it and to mitigate it. Are there other incentives beyond regulatory improvements that we can conceive of that might perhaps help to accelerate action as well as measurement? Any thoughts on that from anyone? Helen, anything you've come across? I'm going to keep turning to you first, by the way. I should warn you now.
So it's a really good question, because it certainly is, there's a lot of focus now on reporting and disclosure. And as Jenny and others have been talking about, particularly in the nature space, at the moment, that's still coalescing. It's not as mature as the climate space is. Right. And it's fair to say that there is, I'm a specialist in this field, and I'm sometimes a little bit overwhelmed at the amount of different acronyms and new ways of doing things and new initiatives that there are. So there's a lot of interest and focus on getting, measurement, target setting, reporting and disclosure, but what we absolutely do not want to drive is reporting at the expense of doing.
Right.
And we do not want to get into the sort of the perfect being the enemy of the good. And I think a lot of the time, if you look at this this in the big picture, there's a lot of commonalities between all of these different approaches, and a lot of what we need to sensibly start taking action that's action in the right direction is just doing the basics and doing them well in terms of understanding nature. Well, in my case, I'm going to talk about nature because it's my specialist field, but understanding your nature impacts and dependencies across your operations and your supply chain, focusing in on what the big ticket items are and making sure you're tackling those first. Picking some sensible metrics that are feasible for you to measure that can get you started, and we can work as a global community of practice, sectorally, to getting more standardization and more alignment, but we've got the basics that we need to get started, and we've got 7 years to solve the climate and nature crisis, so we need to get going with what we've got now.
Well, exactly, and I think we keep making that reference to climate, both from the point of view that excuse me, circularity is an enabler of climate, but also from the point of view that as far as climate action is concerned, we've been there, we've done that, we've got the T-shirt, we bear the scars, we know what doesn't work, so let's please not repeat those mistakes, or let's say, maybe not mistakes, but let's go faster and get to the obvious conclusions of convergence and simplification. And perhaps building further on that, Jenny, I'll perhaps turn to you with this one, because you made reference to the alphabet soup. And of course, as the World Business Alliance, you're doing your best to help to converge that. What do you see as the sort of the end game? There are many methods of measurement, many ways of evaluating performance. Is there work going on towards an evolving standard, something along the lines of the greenhouse gas protocol, for example, when it comes to the rule book on measuring disclosure? What do you see happening in that space?
So I think long term, all eyes are kind of on the ISSB when it comes to sort of globally accepted rule book on nature. I think you can already see that the TNFD as a disclosure framework was written into the monitoring text of the Global Biodiversity Framework. So you can see that that's very, very strong signal there that the TNFD disclosure framework is here to stay, and it's impactful, and it's something that everyone should be preparing either to report on or to take action as a result of. And I think that, again, what we keep coming back to is we're fairly agnostic in terms of we don't sort of endorse a specific standard or a disclosure framework. We try to pull out the common elements from all of them, because the importance for us is what happens as a result of that. And I think if I could just speak to the previous question about incentives for business.
Please.
World Benchmarking Alliance has an alliance of more than 350 global organizations who have sort of committed to using our data and our insights in some way. And I'm extremely fortunate from the nature side, because the investors are kind of biting our hands off in terms of wanting the data so that they can develop their own sustainability strategies, know where to focus their engagement and stewardship activities. And when it comes to business incentives, of course you have policy on the one side, but on the other side, if really big hitting institutional investors are taking this seriously and are saying to business, these are risks that will impact your business unless they're addressed, you can hardly think of a better incentive than that.
Right. Well, that's an important point. I mean, we shouldn't overlook the importance of financial instruments to incentivize and support the transition to a circular economy. That's absolutely true. And providing, investors with information in a format and at a level of security that will allow them to make those decisions is absolutely key. there are other questions that are related to that. And I'll pick up one more and then we'll open up to the audience. And perhaps, Helen, because you spoke to this earlier, that the insights that you've been generating about the role that circularity can have on nature, and that actually some of those outcomes, when you do start to look at the trade-offs, are not as evident as you would think. So earlier we were talking about an example where a particular company was looking at replacing some sort of oil-derived products with a bio-based alternative, and they perhaps you had some insights from that experience.
Yeah, and if I understood the question correctly, where the question was coming from was that actually, in practice, when you start looking at some of these trade-offs, the trade-offs aren't quite as bad as what you would imagine. And I think that is very much my experience and what I think we should be aiming for as much as we can. The decades that are coming are going to be really tough in a lot of ways. We have a growing population with a absolutely justifiable desire for an improving standard of living. Mm-hmm. We've got limited natural resources. We've got a warming climate. We've got reducing amounts of land and water to do all of this with. We've got a need to sustain biodiversity for its own sake and also for all of the kind of goods and services that it provides to us. But I also see huge potential for a just and equitable and really successful transformation. There's a lot of sort of small scale, as a kind of company scale, landscape scale examples that I've seen of where with just a sort of a bit of extra thought and a bit of extra investment, that what you were doing anyway to make your climate targets can also have really good co-benefits for biodiversity and for local people. Or of other examples, and I'm thinking of an example from a hydropower project we were working on in Africa, where the base case design of that, so it's a hydropower project, it's green energy in some ways, but the base case design of that project, it had impacts on a national park, it required a lot of resettlement, and this is the case we're coming to the point about some of the incentives and drivers around it. Access to finance is sometimes a huge driver for doing something different. So in this particular case, the project couldn't get lender finance, and they said, come on, go back to the drawing board, and the project did go back to the drawing board, and they came up with a new design that not only was more financially successful, generated more power for the same amount of investment in building the thing, didn't require the resettlement, didn't have the impacts on the national park. So sometimes just forcing ourselves to go back to the drawing board and trying to be just a bit cleverer about how we're doing these things can have those kind of win-win-wins that we're looking for. So it's not always going to be possible, but I think there's a huge amount of ways in which the sort of the circular perspective and holistic perspective can allow us to be a lot smarter about how we're doing things.
Well, that's also reassuring that it's not only about trade-offs, but when you dig deeper, you can find these co-benefits in cases. Not always, but you can do. I think that's reassuring. I threatened to open up to questions in the audience. If you have a question, please raise your arm and wave, because we've got a microphone to come around. Anything? Yeah, we have one I can see far left. And another one nearby.
Hello, I'm Raija Polvinen from Kielto, and we are a chemical industry company. And biodiversity is a hot topic today, but we have found it pretty difficult to set any measurable targets. How to measure the company's actions for preserve biodiversity. So do you happen to have any examples on how companies have set targets about biodiversity and if possibly somehow linked in circular economy? That would be a bonus.
Thank you. Can we take the second question and then I'll ask the panel to pick them up?
Thank you very much for a fantastic panel. My name's Sarah Gordon. I run a consultancy called Satala. One of the things that we find, and I love what Helen said about this is not about reporting, this is about going into the action side. However, coming from a mining perspective, what we often see is where people don't trust a company, they ask for more and more and more data and reporting, and this often turns into a bit of a vicious cycle, so that nobody has time to do anything other than report, and actually that reporting then creates disaster rather than the opportunities being realised. So do you have any hints and tips with regards to how to break out of that vicious cycle of the endless reporting of different bits of data? Thank you.
Thank you. So, panel, a couple of questions. One about biodiversity in particular, and how to measure and incentivize that. And the other one about getting out of the cycle of endless layers of transparency of data to support claims. Christian, perhaps on the first question on biodiversity, I'm sure you've come across this topic.
Actually, what I can do is to share some personal experience from my own sustainability field trials that I'm running on some of our forward farms in Germany. And when it comes to concretely measuring biodiversity in the field, to really robustly and auditably measure it, it's comparatively expensive, at least at the current state of the art. So, for example, I just wanted to measure the earthworm populations. I even tried a citizen science protocol to keep down the costs. What I earned in the end was a lot of variability, and it was still quite expensive. When you really think about the upscaling part, and this is here quite important, it was not possible to scale it really up to more farms, just because of the costs in the background. So what we are doing here is we connect to the different targets of the Global Biodiversity Framework, so what is indicated there. When it comes to the reduction of the risk from chemical products, we focus on this methodology, focused on the environmental impact reduction. We have a look at the use talks and at the pest LCI, so it's a modeling approach combined with data from the use of chemical products. We also focus on in how far we can deliver on the target, the GBF target 10 on sustainable intensification of agriculture. This is about increasing the yields in the field in a sustainable manner, and also provide here proof points. And in the end, it's a lot about the transparency, being open with our own data, really providing it to the public. So we have a biotransparency website, so you can easily Google it, and then you really can go to the safety reports that actually each and everyone can make their own picture on how we assess the environmental safety of our products. And this also goes down towards the field testing. Right. So quite broad perspective here.
So it's quite a bit of experience, I would say, around the topic of biodiversity reporting. I'm sure perhaps, Christian, you might be able to answer some other questions offline if the questioner has any. With regard to this sort of endless cycle of peeling back the onion on more and more disclosure, Jenny, I can see you smiling and nodding. Perhaps you got a perspective on that one?
Yeah, thank you for the really excellent question. It made me reflect back on the results of the first nature benchmark that we published, where actually we got some pushback because some of the companies that scored the best were actually household names for bad reasons, for scandals. And those scandals had actually driven sort of high-level change within the organization, and the level of disclosure and reporting was significantly higher among many mining companies than among different sectors, I think as a result, as you said, of just being under more scrutiny because of things that have happened. Within WBA, we attempt to not add to this reporting burden at all because we only use publicly available data, I should say that, and that's a principle that we use because we believe that all stakeholders should have access to this data. So we collect everything that we can, and then we send the company an initial score saying, based on what we have found and the evidence that we have found publicly, we believe that you're scoring this and this and this across all of these indicators. So we give them the chance to correct us if there's things that we missed, that does happen. But in that way, we try to not increase the reporting burden on them. And I think that in the medium term, ISSB will, sort of become the sort of cornerstone of reporting and disclosures that companies can sort of expect to follow.
There seems to be a lot of thirst for standardization and simplification. Tim, in all of the work that you were doing looking into nature indicators and developing roadmaps, what was your experience in terms of what's the appropriate level of disclosure that provides confidence but doesn't create more measurement and less action?
Well, it's a difficult middle ground to find.
Yes.
But I'd like to go back to I think what Jenny said as well. We've seen in the Nordics a similar picture as some of the pioneers. I think of the Swedish EcoGain initiative as well that has looked at a similar picture in the Nordics. And I think it's important here to think that, yes, there's a lot of data out there. How do you get started? But everything, in a sense, flows as well, I think, from once you start measuring your dependencies and impacts to interpret that. That also informs how Jenny mentioned the importance of setting a solid baseline. I think that is really key to, when setting the right targets, to not treat them in a vacuum. And here I would just like to take the chance to congratulate also WBCSD on publishing the new circular transition indicators with the nature indicator, because I think that is a direct answer also to the second question. To get started, getting a sense of the big picture. How can we see, if we choose these circular business models, what are the big picture impacts on biodiversity to help inform action? So I agree with the previous speakers that have said that you don't need to wait, so you can really get started today. So I think that is it's also very, very topical right now with a busy week, the World Biodiversity Day, the SBTN, and now the CTI.
No, I think that's a vital point, and I would say that that's one of the design principles of the work that's been done so far is, find the biggest material category, in this case land use, lay out a methodology and indicator that has many stakeholder inputs, including, by the way, alignment with SBTN, and allow businesses to get working. I have no doubt that, as Helen said, there will be co-benefits that people will find along the way, and as the metric continues to evolve, I'll come back to that in a moment. I'm sure that we'll see opportunities for that. Are there any final questions that oh, there's one on the right. That's why I didn't see it, sorry. And we have a microphone, please.
Rannveig Hjaltadóttir, I'm a researcher at Nord University in Norway. And firstly, thank you all very much. It's been so informative. And I'm sorry, I'm not going to step on your comment earlier on don't wait for perfect, but sadly my question is a little in that direction. Can you, it's more of a, can you comment on? Because we have, from recent years, several examples of where how we choose and what we choose to measure has actually led to increase in bad behavior somewhere else. So parallel moves. Can you add some comments on this area, and what is it we can do to try to learn from our mistakes in these areas?
Thank you, and that's an excellent question. And you're right, we mustn't be, too quick to identify material topics and move ahead. We do need to think that there can be consequences of our actions. So I'll open that up to the panel, experiences that you've had in that field. Perhaps anyone would like to comment?
I can just jump in quickly in terms of, I think we're all a bit tired of playing sustainability whack-a-mole, where you kind of fix one thing and it pops up somewhere else. So our contribution towards that is that we do assess all 1,000 companies on all 25 indicators, and that, we believe, should help bring to light if a company, takes some really fabulous action on water withdrawals. They'll be rewarded for that in their scoring on the water withdrawal indicator. If that comes at the expense of, stakeholder engagement or ensuring access to sanitation, they'll be punished for that on the flip side by not scoring well on that. So I don't think that there is, a perfect answer, and certainly sometimes there are trade-offs, but I think, it's where the importance of that assessment comes from, because it also allows stakeholders to test your understanding and test your reasoning and understand why you as a company have chosen to prioritize this issue above other issues that they might care about as well. So yeah, that's kind of the first step for us.
I like your analogy of whack-a-mole with sustain. It really resonates, I'm sure, with a lot of people. You try and get one thing right and somebody then points out, oh, wait a minute, you might have overlooked this. So it's finding that balance, I think, is critical. Talking about the circular economy for several years, in recent times, the Oscar-winning movie that I'm sure many of you have seen, Everything Everywhere All at Once, makes me feel like it was written about the circular economy sometimes, because that's how it feels, right? It's not conveniently boxed up like climate is, in a sense. There's relatively few drivers, and we're dealing with one system, which is the climate system. But that's why standardized metrics are so important. They may not be perfect, they may not be all-encompassing, but they're better than not having metrics, that's for sure. And if we can mobilize more and more of the business community to implement them and to continue to evolve them, I think that will be to everyone's benefit. I should check, because I can't see everybody from here. Is Suzanne Kuipers from KPMG in the room? Put your hand up if you are. Oh, there you are, right at the back. Hi, Suzanne. I wanted to recognize you because Suzanne collaborated with me on the work that led to CTI, and I think it's really important that you and KPMG's work get identified on this, because it's building momentum. And it's not the end of the story. Sitting here down at the front with me are Irena and Larissa from WBCSD, who are about to start work on version 5, I understand, which will, for the first time, start to address equality metrics within the circularity space. This initiative around creating a standardized set of metrics, as I said at the beginning, what gets measured gets done. And if I can go back to my good friend Suzanne, what gets measured, disclosed, and audited really gets done, right? So when it comes to turning those metrics into disclosable and investment quality data, then that's what we're striving for. Now, metrics alone is not sufficient, and as we've heard before, there are incentives and regulations that need to be addressed. And in that context, I'm happy to also be able to share with you that WBCSD, together with UNEP, One Planet Network, and several other partners, including Chatham House, who probably are here as well, and Gasera, who I know are here, will be starting work on a global circularity protocol. Now, I'm sure that word lands heavily with many of you as it did with us, but we're trying to draw inspiration as the co-responsible for the greenhouse gas protocol, together with the World Resource Institute, on the one hand, and of course, on the other hand, having done work a lot on metrics. We feel that the opportunity is now there to try and develop a kind of a rule book for circularity. It would be great if we had one single legally enforceable document. That may be nirvana, we may never get there, but we will certainly give it a good go, and we'll be taking as many stakeholders with us. And my colleague Philippi down here will be driving that work. And I thought it would be important to share that with you, because it's not only about harmonizing the metrics, but it's also about incentivizing policymakers and regulators to implement circularity into their decision making. For those of us that come from an industrial setting, we will know that as we're sitting here right now, there are technical committees sitting somewhere else in the world that are developing input to policymakers on new regulation for all sorts of things. And to get to that level of expertise to be invited to a technical committee, none of them will have done any education and learnt anything about circular economy. I mean, I'm being black and white, but that's probably the case. They will have all gone to university 10, 20 years ago. So we have to help them by bringing forward some guidelines, a rule book around adding circularity to their thinking. If you're developing new legislation on personal protective equipment, you know, hard hats or vests or whatever, are you thinking about circularity as one of the outcomes that you need to deliver on? So that's what the protocol work will be all about. Maybe we'll come up with a set of principles, but I wanted to use this as an opportunity to let you know where some work will be going in the future. And with that, I'd really like to thank my panel, or our panel, I should say, for joining us here on stage. So Helen, Tim, Jenny, and Christian, thank you very much. And thank you all for your time.